Welcome to The Red-Haired Archaeologist. I am your host, author, and sunscreen advocate, Amanda Hope Haley. Thank you for spending some time with me today, studying artifacts our Near Eastern ancestors left behind, and considering if those items just might change how we read or read into Scripture. I think you can probably hear that there's a big smile on my face today. It's because we're going to be talking about one of my favorite topics, and I finally get to do an episode of this podcast where I feel like I'm going to end with a period instead of a question mark. This whole season, I feel like I have been throwing lots of history and lots of theories and lots of questions at you. I'm just kind of saying, here's everything we know, go make a decision for yourself. But today, we are going to be talking about a group of people who are called the Sea Peoples. Now, don't get me wrong, we don't know absolutely everything there is to know about them, but as of about 2019, archaeology has given us more answers about them than we have questions. But I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself. So let's talk about Egypt. If you ever go to Egypt, if you ever take a tour of Egypt, or even if you just get online and take a look at itineraries, every single one of them is going to include a stop in a place called the Valley of the Kings. This is where dozens of tombs were built for pharaohs and high-ranking officials. This is where King Tut's tomb was discovered. Back during the New Kingdom, this was the place for burials. As I hope you remember, the New Kingdom was sort of the golden age of Egypt, and it ran from about 1567 to 1085 BCE. Ramses the Great was buried in this huge complex that was there. His successor, Merneptah, was built there. You're going to hear that name again. And near the Valley of the Kings is another structure called Medinet Habu, and it is the mortuary temple for Ramses III. Its walls are filled with hieroglyphic inscriptions, as are most ancient Egyptian temples and tombs. But this one has a unique artistic portrayal of a great sea battle on the side of it. The writings and images at Medinet Habu are about a group of marauding invaders whom scholars have named the Sea Peoples. We've called them the Sea Peoples since about the 19th century. We sometimes talk about them as if they're just one group of people, but actually they were 9 distinct groups of people. They came to Egypt from islands in the Western Mediterranean, in the Eastern Mediterranean, in the Aegean, and some people will even say they came from as far away as Cyprus. There are 9 distinct groups. The thing that they have in common is that they were all really fierce warriors. Their arrival in Egypt and in the Levant is how we mark the end of the Bronze Age, around 1200 BC. So their arrival was literally historic. They attacked Egypt twice in their history. The first time was in 1207. That was under the pharaoh Merneptah, who I just mentioned. There were 5 groups who were involved in this attack. And what they did is they coordinated with some Libyan tribes who were starving at the time and who wanted to get into Egypt to have access to food. They coordinated with the Libyan tribes and attacked Egypt. Pharaoh Merneptah, in his record of this war, says that he crushed them in only 6 hours. Even though huge groups of warrior peoples came together, the Pharaoh Merneptah tells the world that he was super strong and he crushed them really, really quickly. The record of this battle is in something called the Merneptah Stela, is named for him, or sometimes people will also call it the Israel Stela. This is just a little bit of a side note. The reason we call it that is because this is the only known reference to Israel in any of the ancient Egyptian texts. It basically says that I, Merneptah, laid waste to Israel. That's pretty much it. The Stela itself goes on, but all it says about Israel is that it was discovered by Sir William Flinders Petrie. Your first day in an archaeology class, you will learn that he's the father, really, of archaeology as we think about it today. He's the first person who tried to bring some order and some science into it so that archaeology went from going and doing grave robbing to actually being a branch of anthropology. In 1207, the Sea Peoples were crushed by Merneptah, and then they didn't come back until the next pharaoh. That was Ramses III. Ramses II was Ramses the Great. This is Ramses III. And in 1177, 6 groups of people came in and they attacked not only by land, but also by sea. So Ramses III, in his record of this, says that he conquered him, he beat him, and then he settled the survivors in his strongholds within Egypt. But we know that some of those groups actually settled much farther up the Mediterranean coast. They didn't all stay in Egypt. One of those groups was called the Peliset. Most scholars agree that the Peliset were the Philistines. That's based on linguistics, partially, and you can kind of hear similarities in the words. Peliset, Philistine, you've got the same consonants leading there. There's also agreement that they were the Philistines based on the material culture that was there. In the ground, archaeologists can see when the Philistines landed in what was formerly the Canaanite cities. You can see when they conquered them. There were 5 big Philistine cities: Ashdod, Ekron, Gaza, Gat, and my personal favorite, Ashkelon. Ashkelon's the first place that I ever dug back in 2004, so Ashkelon has my heart. At these sites, there's evidence of destruction, there's evidence that building styles changed, and most importantly, pottery styles changed. So before we had the kinds of scientific methods of analysis that we have today, dates were determined largely based on pottery forms and the ways that they were decorated. Today, we have carbon-14 dating. As we're excavating something, we can mark everything with GPS positioning and create virtual tells in the computer that we can look at later, even after the tell itself has been excavated and maybe is gone. And most importantly, we can run DNA analysis. So in 2016, during the final year of excavation at Ashkelon, the people working there uncovered a large Philistine cemetery. With all of the bones that were there was enough DNA from all these thousands of years ago for scientists to be able to test the DNA that was in the bones. If you've ever done DNA testing, if you've done 23andMe or Ancestry or one of those, then you know when you get the results, you learn a lot about your recent ancestors, but then there will also be information about your distant ancestors, the ones who lived hundreds and hundreds of years ago. That actually worked for the Philistines too, when they did this. That DNA told us where the ancestors of those particular Philistines in that cemetery, it told us where they came from. The ancestors of those corpses did in fact come from the Mediterranean and the Aegean. As much as I love Ashkelon, and I really do, and as important as it is to understanding the Philistines, really the city of Gat is much more famous. That's because of one of its residents. I bet you've heard of him. He is a guy named Goliath. In 1 Samuel 17, he loses a battle to the future King David in hand-to-hand combat. This contest has entered our collective consciousness as the ultimate underdog story. You don't have to be a Bible reader to have heard of David and Goliath kinds of battles. Classical painters would often depict David as a young man wielding maybe a small handheld slingshot, and they would paint Goliath as this colossally tall giant. But the Bible itself and archaeology actually give us a totally different view of reality. To begin with, this may surprise you, and please fact check me on this. The Bible never actually uses the word giant to describe Goliath. As I know I've mentioned several times this season and really throughout the entire podcast, sometimes the earliest manuscripts of the Bible disagree. The 2 earliest are the Greek Septuagint, which is from 300 BCE, and the Hebrew Masoretic text, which is from 1000 CE. This is one place in describing Goliath where they disagree. The much older but translated manuscript says that he was almost 7 feet tall, but the much newer, yet still in Hebrew version, says that he was almost 10 feet tall. So when you have a discrepancy like this, it raises the literal question, was more lost in translation, or was it lost over that additional millennium of scribes copying and recopying the Hebrew? We usually don't have an answer to that question. Most of the places where there are disagreements like that, they're so minor. Maybe it's obvious which one was right, which one was wrong. We continued to debate this for 1,000 years until the 1940s when the Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered. And the Dead Sea Scrolls actually answered this question. I wish this got more press than it did. But in the 1940s, in the Dead Sea Scrolls, there was a Hebrew version of the Book of Samuel. It's called the Great Samuel Scroll. It is almost as old as the Septuagint, but it's still in Hebrew. It wasn't translated. According to it, the Greek is actually correct. The Septuagint is correct. Goliath, he was tall, but he was not mythically giant tall. He was right under 7 feet tall. The material culture that we find at Gat and at Ashkelon and in the other cities of the Philistine Pentapolis support the Septuagint and the Dead Sea Scroll reading that he was just under 7 feet tall, because all the bones that have been found are of average human size. No giant mythical bones have been found there. The bones of the Philistines may have been the same size as the bones of their neighbors, of the Canaanites and the Israelites, but there was something about Gat that was a little bit different, and that was its architecture. I think about how we today collectively wonder, how did the ancient Egyptians build the pyramids? How did they manage to lift those massive stones up into the sky before they had the kind of technology that we have today? There are lots of theories out there. We really don't know. We don't have an answer to that. Well, the architecture at Gat may have had the ancient Israelites asking the same kind of question. In 2019, excavators unexpectedly found a new layer of civilization at Gat, and they dated it to the 11th century BCE. And so that would have been about a generation or so after Egypt told the Sea Peoples to go there, and roughly the time when David would have been in combat with Goliath. All of the buildings in this particular layer are made from significantly larger materials than other structures in the layers surrounding them. The stones that were used were about 2 meters long, when typically what you find in the Levant are about half a meter long. And the city itself had a footprint that was about twice the size of most of the footprints of other cities at the time. And so these size differences may indicate that these older Philistines who were building this 11th century city, they were retaining some of the architectural traditions of the Aegean civilizations where they came from. What they built, what the Israelites saw when they went to Gat, was alien. It was alien in the sense that it came from another country, not alien in the sense that it required a giant species in order to build these things. But it was bigger and it was different from what they were used to seeing. One thing that tradition, scripture, biblical archaeology, and Egyptology all agree on is that the Philistines were mighty warriors. The Egyptians depict the Sea Peoples, and when I say Sea Peoples, I'm including the Peliset in this, I'm including the Philistines in this. When they made their art, they're pictured as wearing these unique feathered headdresses. And they're carrying round shields that are unlike the shields of other people. Their boats are big and they're shaped differently. And they're shown using chariots in battle. And the chariots are large enough that 3 men are in there at the same time. Ramses III at Medinet Habu, he bragged about defeating them. But really the truth is that he didn't. What Ramses III did was cut his losses. He allowed them to stay in Egypt. He allowed them to settle in Egypt because he couldn't beat them, because he couldn't push them back into the Mediterranean, back to the Aegean, back to all the places where he came from. He allowed them to settle, and then he hired them as mercenaries because he saw what incredible warriors they were, and he wanted to be able to use that. The arrival of the Sea Peoples on the shores of Egypt is seen as the beginning of the end of the ancient Egyptian empire. It does mark in history the end of the New Kingdom era. It does mark the end of the golden age of Egypt. From this point forward in history, Egypt is going to be coming up against other empires. Next, it's going to be Assyria. They're going to be coming up against them and they're going to be losing. They're going to be taking losses, and Egypt is going to be shrinking from here on out. And it was the Sea Peoples, it was the Philistines who changed history. The Red-Haired Archaeologist podcast is researched, hosted, and recorded by me, Amanda Hope Haley. It is sound edited by Nicholas Allaire. New episodes are released each Thursday. To interact with me and other listeners, make sure you click the follow button on the Red-Haired Archaeologist pages on Facebook and Instagram. Then check out my website, theredhairedarchaeologist.com, where you can subscribe to my monthly newsletter, sign up to join me on next year's tour of Israel and book me to come speak in your hometown.